Red Hill's Justice. A Robin Castle short story by Elwood Flynn. Narrated by Thomas Cassidy and Dana Day. Featuring music by Nick Power.
Bring the dark out, bring your dead. A belt of bullets cased in lead. We wander into town, and if we go astray, moonshine, moonshine, light my way.
Chapter 1. There are two things you need to know about Robin Castle. Number 1, he's about the biggest man you'll ever see. And 2, he attracts trouble like starving rats to a cracked grain silo. He walked alongside his horse, looking at his boots as he kicked up dirt, perfectly at peace, his left hand on Muddy's mane. His guns were stowed away in her saddlebags, and the world seemed entirely empty. He hadn't come across another soul in days. He had seen plenty of branded cattle on the Red Hills, but he hadn't yet seen a ranch house. He figured they were probably over the other side of the hills. Muddy was a grey Percheron, one of the biggest horse breeds you can get. They aren't like most draft horses, wide and chunky looking, but instead have the proportions of a normal horse scaled up. She was strong from years of travel. They gave the illusion, if you were watching them from afar, that Castle was no bigger than an average man. An average guy with an average horse. The sight of them from afar would breed false confidence. It's only when you get close that you realize you have a problem. Walking gave Muddy's back a break, and Castle's legs some exercise, though his boots were almost worn through. 2 years ago, Castle left his home and his profession. In New York he had been a police officer, until a criminal he failed to catch destroyed his life. He chased that man all the way across the country, and when he got his revenge, he had no reason to go back. Now he drifted from place to place, looking for a reason to stay alive, collecting the odd bounty for funds. Castle heard the sound of bacon sizzling before he smelled it. He hadn't realized how hungry he was. He stopped at the top of a low-rise and looked down over a vast plain of grazing land. In the middle of the pasture were 3 cowboys, one of them busying himself at the back of a chuck wagon. The canvas sides had been rolled up, revealing cubbyholes with tins of food, coffee, cups, and plates. The back was lowered and set up like a table. The bacon was in a pan hung over a fire. The man at the chuck wagon was preparing coffee. The 2 other cowboys had just branded a steer, which was clambering to its feet. Once the steer found its footing, it aimed a kick at the cowboy holding the iron. Understandably, Castle thought, but missed. The man cussed and gave it an angry kick back. It snorted and lurched away to join the rest of the herd. Castle watched this with curiosity. He'd never witnessed a roundup before, if this is what that was. The cowboy who'd kicked the steer spotted him. He tapped his friend on the elbow and pointed in Castle's direction. Both their faces became serious. The second man hissed something to his partner at the chuck wagon, who responded by looking up at Castle, and then taking a rifle out of the back of the wagon and tossing it over to his friend. Castle smiled. He needed a distraction from his thoughts and the sheer mundanity of wandering, and these men looked like the entertaining type. Castle's Smith & Wesson .44 Russian was stowed away in Muddy's saddlebag. The Winchester Yellow Boy was loaded and ready in its scabbard. He figured he wouldn't need them. Best to avoid bloodshed. These were hard-working men after all, just wary of strangers. He stood still and waited for them to come to him. The men mounted their horses and headed up the hill, slow and careful. As they came close, Castle saw a scar down the steer kicker's face and began to question his assumptions that these were just honest, hard-working men. But then, cowboys fell off horses and got kicked by cows all the time. Maybe it was nothing. But it looked like a knife scar.
"I'm unarmed, gentlemen,"
said Castle loud and clear. "You with the bar am?" said the one in front with the rifle. He was thin, but clearly fit. All of them were. Bodies like steel cords, deceptively strong. Castle was not deceptively strong. He was the opposite of deceptively strong. He was obviously strong. Castle looked like he could pick up a cow with one hand and throw it over a mountain.
"I don't know what a bar am is,"
said Castle, honestly.
"I'm just passing by. Not looking for any trouble."
"Nobody just passes through here. Ain't nowhere to pass through to. It's a mountain."
"I don't know about that. There's always something to see. Bunch of cowboys doing honest work, for example."
"That's supposed to be a joke?" This from the man on Castle's right. Castle had to look up, as they were on horseback, and he was not. But not by much. 2 of the cowboys were armed, and there were 3 of them. Castle figured these men thought they had the advantage, and technically they did. But Robin Castle had the advantage of being Robin Castle. The man on his right had a gun on his hip. Looked like a Colt Dragoon. A good weapon, but clumsy compared to Castle's Russian. Not that it made much difference with the Russian packed away in Muddy's saddlebag. "I asked you a question," said the man on the right. Castle looked at the herd of cows. At this distance he couldn't make out the markings of the brand, but it was clear that the freshest ones were bigger than the others.
"You boys rustling cows?"
said Castle. "He is from the Bar M. Get him!" said the scarred steer kicker on the left, the only one in the group confident enough to come unarmed. He was slightly bigger than the others, a harder brow and jaw, grey eyes. If any of them were going to be a problem, it would be him. Castle was outmanned, outgunned, and out in the middle of nowhere. As far as Castle was concerned, the odds were on his side. These men were in a lot of trouble. They just didn't know it yet. The one on the right went for his gun. It was the biggest mistake he ever made. Chapter 2. Castle's mind was quicker than his actions, and he had at least a split second to plan his attack. Plenty of time. He reckoned he could disarm the man on his right currently going for his Colt, and take out the one in the middle with the rifle before any of the men realized they were somehow outnumbered. 1-3. As the man on the right went for his Colt, Castle raised his right leg and slammed his boot into the horse's stirrup, crushing the man's toes and pinning his foot where it was. The man grunted with pain. The horse tried to buck, but Castle took the rein at its mouth and pulled it down, still keeping the man's foot wedged in place. With his free hand, he grabbed the man's ear between finger and thumb, twisted, and pulled him clear out of the saddle. The man hit the ground hard, winding himself and kicking up a cloud of dry dirt, his foot still stuck in the stirrup, painfully twisted. Castle reached down, plucked the man's Colt from his holster, and aimed it at the man in the middle. Reacting quickly, the man cocked his lever-action carbine and raised it to aim. Castle was quicker. He pulled the hammer on the Colt and fired. The flame that bloomed from the barrel was as long as his arm. The sound was like thunder. Castle felt the boom in his chest. It felt good. made him feel alive. The knuckles of the middle guy's trigger hand burst in a confetti cloud of blood and bone. The rifle fell, as blood flowed from what was left of his hand. The cowboy stared at the remnants of his fingerless palm like it was a puzzle he couldn't quite fathom. The gunshot caused the horse to Castle's right to rear up, ready to bolt. Castle stamped down hard, a horsehair away from the fallen cowboy's face, the spur on the back of his boot ripping through the man's cheek, chipping a tooth on the way through. The horse bolted, and the man's head jerked, his upper teeth snagging on Castle's spur. A lesser man than Castle might have tripped, but Castle stood still, solid as a rock. The man's foot slipped free of his boot, and the horse galloped away with the boot flapping in the stirrup. Castle wrenched his spur from the man's mouth, tearing through what remained of his cheek.
"You shot my fingers off,"
said the man in the middle, ghost pale, still staring at his fingerless palm. He swayed drunkenly in his saddle. The man on the ground clutched his face and yelled in agony. Castle kicked him in the back of the head, knocking him out cold. Not to make a point. He just didn't like the sound of a man wailing. Castle lazily pointed the Colt at the guy on the left. The one in charge. The one with the scar. The steer kicker. The guy in the middle fainted, fell off his horse, and hit the ground like a dropped shovel. Castle kept his eyes on the last man.
"What is a bar M?"
said Castle.
"Who are you?" "That doesn't answer my question."
Answer mine first.
"I already told you who I am. Robin Castle."
I'm Dirk Manning.
"That wasn't my question."
You heard that name before?
"No." "You heard mine?"
No.
"Well then, I guess we have something in common."
You might want to be careful who you're dealing with. People fear my name in these parts."
"Don't care,"
said Castle, and shot Dirk Manning in the shin. The bone shattered, and his calf muscle splattered against the horse's hind leg like mincemeat. Chapter 3. The chuck wagon was freestanding. The horses had been unhitched, so they could graze amongst the cattle. Castle didn't know a single thing about farming or ranch handling. Never tied a lasso. Wouldn't know what to do with one if he did. He grew up in a city, where the meat came butchered, and the ground underfoot was hard. He wouldn't have known it was called a chuck wagon, but its function was clear. It was a cart for carrying things, with a kitchen at the back to prepare food and coffee. By now, the bacon in the pan was nothing more than charred strips. Inedible, which was a shame. Castle was hungry. There was a hot pot of coffee on a stove on the fold-down table. Apart from the groans of one of the men tied up on the ground behind him, the bubbling of the coffee was the only sound other than birds, cattle, and the breeze. It was a pleasant scene. Castle took a moment to take it in. He breathed in deeply, letting the rich aroma of the coffee fill his lungs. He poured himself a cup, turned around and admired the view behind him. That was a whole different story. The 3 horses were still at the top of the hill. Leading down the hill to where Castle now stood was a long streak of blood in the green grass. It was a view ruined by violence. Castle shook his head and drank from his cup. It was hot and strong, just how he liked it. Muddy stood nearby, thinking whatever horses thought in these kinds of situations. Close enough for Castle to reach out and affectionately pet, which he did. Although Castle didn't know how to tie a lasso, he could tie a knot. He glanced down at the 3 men tied up and gagged on the ground behind Muddy. Their eyes were wide and frantic, each man fixated on Castle, watching him, unable to move or talk. Castle's weird calmness terrified them. Castle smiled and raised his cup. He had hitched them by the ankles to the back of Muddy's saddle. The 3 ropes he had found tied to their horses' saddle horns were long enough to bind their arms to their sides and lash their legs together so tightly they looked like strung pork ready for roasting. Castle had walked Muddy down to the chuck wagon, the bloody streak marking their route. Castle enjoyed the last of the coffee. The past days of trekking across unfamiliar landscape had offered little by way of distraction. An occasional wild animal, some attractive foliage, and his own thoughts. The misguided rustlers had broken up the boredom nicely. He tossed the coffee dregs over his prisoners and took to examining the contents of the chuck wagon. What he found stopped him cold. Chapter 4. It was a girl, maybe 7 years old, gagged with a red bandana, her ankles tied to her wrists behind her back. Castle looked down at her dumbstruck, tin coffee mug in hand. Her eyes were wide, blue, and full of tears, her brow quivering with fear. Castle put the mug down and took out his knife in as unthreatening a manner as he could.
Don't worry, kid. You're safe.
He slid the blade between her cheek and the fabric and sliced the bandana clear through. He put the knife away and gently removed the gag. She didn't cry out, didn't make a sound. Her mouth was turned down in a way so sorrowful, Castle could have cried right along with her. He thought of his own daughter at that age, and anger rose up from his belly. He looked back at the 3 men on the ground. Now, they were truly afraid. He untied the girl and lifted her out of the wagon.
You're safe,
he said again. He knelt and stood her in front of him, but her legs were too weak to stand. She had been bound in the same position for too long. He sat her down so she could lean against the wagon wheel.
Who are you?
She didn't answer. Couldn't. She just stared up into Castle's eyes and trembled.
You don't need to be afraid of me. I'm going to help you.
He looked around. The cattle had come closer. The more recently branded had larger marks like 2 big diamonds. The older brands were a letter M, half the size. Castle looked at the fire where the brand glowed in the hot embers. It was a letter M. They had been using it upside down to turn the M's into a 2-diamond brand. Castle looked at the girl.
Do you know what bar M means?
She nodded, but still wouldn't talk.
Is the bar M your father's brand?
It was a shot in the dark, but it was all Castle had. Her lips turned down further, and she sobbed. She gave a single nod. Good guess. Castle stood up and retrieved the red bandana. She flinched away from it when he put it near her face.
It's okay. I'm just going to clean you up a bit.
She went bolt still as he wiped the tears away.
I'm going to get you home.
She looked away, a real sadness in her eyes. He picked her up and placed her in front of the wagon.
I need to put a horse on this thing, and then we'll ride out of here together. Okay?
She nodded.
Do you know where home is?
She shook her head.
That's all right. We'll find it.
He went to the fire and picked up the brand by the handle. Even at arm's length, he could feel the heat from it on his face. The men began their muffled, anguished pleading before Castle even started towards them. The mountains echoed with the sounds of sizzling meat and agonized screams. Chapter 5. The trail over the Red Hills was uneven and spotted with small rocks. The chuck wagon and its 2 riders were comfortable enough, but the 3 men dragging behind it felt every sharp edge. Only one of them passed out. The other 2 were wide awake. All 3 faces bore harsh red burn marks in the rough shapes of diamonds. Muddy was pulling the wagon, and doing a good job of it. The girl still wasn't talking, but as they came over a rise, she stood in her seat and pointed excitedly at a property that had come into view. A small old house that backed onto the hills, overlooking an empty corral and a good 50 acres of fenced-off grassland.
That home?
Said Castle. She nodded enthusiastically.
What did I tell you?
She sat down and smiled at Castle. The girl spent the rest of the ride looking wide-eyed towards home, her hands in her lap and her knees bouncing with nervous energy. Muddy pulled the chuck wagon through a gate and up to the house. A man wearing a shattered pair of spectacles paced the porch, bloodstains on his shirt and smeared across his forehead. He stopped pacing when he saw the wagon, and squinted with his hand to his brow, shielding the sun from his eyes. Without his eyeglasses, the man was struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. He probably hadn't expected a waving child next to a giant man. He frowned. Castle helped the child down. They came forward, and when their faces became clear, the short-sighted man took off his hat and raised it over his head in joy. "Annie!" He smiled so wide, Castle could have counted his teeth. The girl ran and hugged her father.
She's not much of a talker,
said Castle, approaching. The man moved his daughter behind him and stepped back, instinctively protective. "She's shy. Who are you? One of Manning's thugs?"
I'm nobody. Just passing through and came by some trouble.
What's your name?
Robin Castle.
Where's Dirk Manning?
Hold on,
said Castle, and walked to the back of the wagon. He unhitched the ropes, dragged the 3 bodies to the house, and ungagged the leader. Manning took in a sharp breath, coughed, and hawked a glob of bloody phlegm into the dirt. "You're a dead man," he spat, staring up at Castle. Castle ignored the threat and looked at the father.
This the guy?
The father stepped forward hesitantly. Manning's face was almost unrecognizable. The diamond brand had burned into his features, blinded him in one eye, and scorched a dash into his hairline. The father leaned in, looked the bound man in the eye, examined the line of his jaw, his hair, and his clothes. "Yeah, that's Manning. What happened to him?"
"I did. Why did he have your daughter hogtied and gagged in the back of the wagon?"
"He said it was insurance. Didn't want me going to the sheriff. Said he would leave her and the wagon in the hills for me after they had taken my livestock. Told me if anybody came after them, I would have to search for her body piece by piece. It was just a threat," said Manning. Castle thought for a moment, and then took a good steady look at the father.
"Will you contact the sheriff and let the law deal with these men?"
said Castle. "I'm inclined to let the vultures at him." Castle saw no real problem in that.
"All right. Then I'll make my way."
"Let me give you something for your trouble."
"I don't want any money."
"Well, you're lucky on that front, 'cause I ain't got any. You need some supplies?" Castle accepted a little dry meat, a loaf of bread, and some fresh water. The father offered a blanket, but Castle shook his head.
I appreciate it, but I have everything I need.
Before leaving, Castle knelt in front of the girl and held her hand.
Don't you worry about what happened today. Bad guys exist. There's no denying it. But they always face justice. Karma has a way of finding balance.
She thought for a moment before speaking.
Are you Karma?
I was today,
said Castle. Castle handed Annie's father the rifle and sidearm he'd taken from Dirk Manning's men. Then, he got in the saddle and rode Muddy away from the ranch, carrying on in the direction he had been heading that morning. Before he rode out of sight, he looked back. Saw the look in the father's eyes, recognized the expression there. A cold resolution. Castle was about a mile away when he heard 3 shots ring out over the red hills. He figured the name of these parts was apt, at least today.
Bring the dark out, bring your dead. A belt of bullets cased in lead. We wander into town, and if we go astray, moonshine, moonshine, light my way. Laid the red pen in the sun. When the moonlight hits my gun, beating on the dead, smell it on my breath. Moonshine, moonshine, give me strength. Moonshine, moonshine, Lay the resin in my wound. Wanna run and get the sun. When I get to mine, feel it on my way. Moonshine, moonshine, light 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 my way.
The end. If you enjoyed this story and are yet to discover the violent horror of Castle's origin story, you'll find it in Hot Lead, the first of the Robin Castle series of westerns. Available as a Kindle ebook. Also available in paperback from Amazon, Waterstones, Barnes & Noble, Booktopia, and Foils. And of course my personal favorite, available as an audiobook from Audible. Narrated by yours truly, and the wonderful Dana Day. Thank you for listening.